As the final week of the 2024 election passes, as the final talking points from both parties demand our attention, as we scroll through life from within virtual reality, from a world wherein spam has become the news, we should make an effort to look beyond what appears as immediately relevant and consider how this election might inform us about what will come next, rather than allowing ourselves to be taken in by razzle-dazzle, rather than pondering whether Donald Trump would make a good whale psychiatrist, or whether the overturning of Roe versus Wade was an act of genocide. We should ask ourselves something altogether different. How did we get here? This question is often understood to translate into another question, namely this one: how did we end up with Trump? However, the question shouldn't be reduced to this. Instead, we should consider it through the lens of David Shields' recent book. As a reviewer from Fordham University put it, the question of how we got here isn't just about Trump, but should be taken up as a challenge. This political moment and David Shields both are asking us to reconsider the problem of philosophical skepticism. The question is, how can we arrive at the truth and make decisions as a society if we allow for uncertainty, ambiguity, and even epistemological skepticism? If it is impossible to develop knowledge or a justified belief about the world, how can we operate politically? How can we retain the aim of providing for the common good, enacting the general will, and progressing toward justice if we must admit to a permanent ignorance? Once you admit what is truth is a live question, you set in motion the world of how we got here. To put it differently, the question might be this: how is it possible that this question, this skepticism about truth, could shift from being a weapon in the hands of progressives and revolutionaries to being wielded by conservatives and reactionaries?
The argument of the book, in my view, is the death of God, the death of truth, the right wing's demonization of deconstruction, the right wing's weaponization of deconstruction as political theater. The first line of the book is Socrates saying, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." Socrates was saying that as a sort of epistemological self-questioning. And now I think it's a case of the weaponization of political discourse.
Is this question, in a sense, always there? Do
Right.
we always feel, basically from the 20th century and now into the 21st, at every moment,
Right.
that somehow reality is gone, and that
Right.
we're now in this false kind of simulacrum or whatever.
Right.
So is there something different about now beyond just saying, well, it's Trump?
Right.
Like, is there something else?
I'm going to indulge and read something. I recently visited a friend's class. My former student, Nina Goss, who's teaching at Fordham now. And I talked about the book in her political science class. And she wrote me later, I think, a really beautiful letter, not just praising the book per se, that's not the point, but that she really articulated the inevitability of Trump. And she said, "So for me, the book is do this work and you'll experience historical consciousness, not read this book and learn why the devils are in charge and what you can do about it." The "we" in the title isn't NPR subscribers, but all of the West, all the legatees of the genealogy of skepticism. The book's form insists that the reader narrates this genealogy herself and engage the complex rhythm of triumphalism, exploitation, certainty, anxiety, doubt, terror, beauty, inspiration, more terror, and exploitation and anxiety, rinse and repeat, so that I earned the last fragment, the search for truth, understood finally as the human tragedy. If I, as the reader, do the work, this genealogy of skepticism offers a terrible revelation. 2024 is not an unprecedented insane asylum. I am not the smart and good watching the moronic and the evil take over. I'm not even the passive sleeping good letting the evil take over. This is the continual agon of Western skepticism. Once you admit what is truth as a live question, you set in motion the world of how we got here.
Okay, I apologize if this next question is too basic, and I apologize to you because I have a feeling that I might be the dumbest person in this room right now. But like you mentioned earlier, how the Nietzsche quote, like God is dead, something I've heard my whole life.
Right.
I've never fully understood that, what the meaning of that is. I mean, I understand the literal meaning. I can project meanings onto it. I mean, obviously a paradox built into it, but even beyond the paradox, I've never fully grasped it.
What God is dead?
Well, what he's really saying when he says that, what his point is. I mean, I know I can understand it literally.
Right.
I can make up something up that seems like it makes sense, but I've never felt confident that I understood.
The man with David Shields at the How We Got Here book reading is Chuck Klosterman. He's the author of many books, but his most successful title is his 2003 collection of essays entitled Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. A critic, writing for the online publication The Outline in 2018, summarized the book this way. Cocoa Puffs' immediate appeal stemmed from some combination of the looseness of the writing, a proto-blog conversational style that would come to dominate the internet, and the subject material, pop culture framed in a loosely academic tone. He took dumb shit, the real world, the Lakers-Celtics rivalry, the semi-incoherent Tom Cruise passion project Vanilla Sky, seriously. But I would characterize Klosterman differently. He is perhaps the quintessential Portlander, the definitive Gen X intellectual, coming up in the world in the aftermath of the failure of the New Left, picking up the pieces after Reaganism, and daring to try to think by starting with the world as he found it. Klosterman exhibits all the strengths and weaknesses of a generation defined by zines, the alt-internet culture, and a certain studied glibness that can't quite slide all the way into cynicism. Here's a quote from Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. Pundits are always blaming TV for making people stupid, movies for desensitizing the world to violence, and rock music for making kids take drugs and kill themselves. These things should be the least of our worries. The main problem with mass media is that it makes it impossible to fall in love with any sense of normalcy. There is no normal because everybody is being twisted by the same sources simultaneously. Klosterman is a product of regressed situationism, just like David Shields and just like me. He took the media environment we occupied as the subject of his art. He is highbrow about what is lowbrow, in a way that may not be possible any longer. He wrote in a mode that the next generation apes, but can't quite take up or make their own. At the book event, he said he didn't quite understand what it means to say God is dead. I believe him. However, when I think of how I might explain the idea to him, I think about John Cusack. In this political moment, to say God is dead might be the same thing as saying John Cusack is cringe.
In a strange way, when we look at the aesthetics of a presidency and we see him on television, Obama looks like a measured, reasonable guy. He's not as bad as Cheney and Bush. He's done some good things. There's all these things, but at least he presents a dignified picture. So here's Trump, who's really an unmasked kind of like dangerous. He looks unhinged visually, like on television, and what he's saying is unhinged, and then he contradicts himself, and it doesn't even matter. So he's sort of like the GOP or the celebrity culture unmasked. He's reality show, television show unmasked. He's short attention span, fame-seeking, money-worshipping culture unmasked. So it's interesting in a way, but I don't think there's probably ever been anyone as dangerous who could be in the Oval Office in my lifetime.
I think that might make the concept clear to Klosterman. On the other hand, there is a more thoroughgoing, less glib answer available on YouTube. It's an answer that has made its way all the way to us from the 90s, from an East Texan philosophy professor named Rick Roderick.
First of all, a parable called The Death of God can't be atheism, right? Because to the bourgeois atheist, it makes no sense to say God died because there wasn't one, so he couldn't have died. So that doesn't make sense. The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life, and about Nietzsche's both fear and exhilaration at what might come next. And we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
When it comes to great stakes, I've just raised the stakes. The Sharper Image is one of my favorite stores with fantastic products of all kinds. That's why I'm thrilled they agree with me. Trump steaks are the world's greatest steaks, and I mean that in every sense of the word.
So when I was in college and when I was a journalist in the 90s, and even in the beginning of the 21st century, I was obsessed with postmodernism. I wanted everything to be postmodern. I can't imagine how many times I misused that term, probably trying to describe a band or a movie or something as postmodern. It just seemed like to be everything,
I know what you mean.
Was that a huge cultural mistake? Like, was postmodernism great for art, but terrible for reality, terrible for society? I mean, was I, in a way, helping propel the thing that has hurt culture the most? That this idea that postmodernism now isn't just an interesting thing. It's like, oh, it's interesting to look at this from a different perspective, or to have it,
Right.
That actually it is the way life exists now, and it is
Right.
the way So is postmodernism terrible?
Is postmodernism terrible?
Like ultimately,
That's your next book.
Like on balance, if we have to weigh it about what it has done that is good and what it has done that is bad, has it ultimately hurt the world more than it has helped?
Truth. Are we really heading into nihilism?
Okay, she's asking if we're kind of working from this point that truth is provisional and all this, are we essentially just barreling toward nihilism because we're saying everything is up for grabs?
I mean, that's the scary question. I mean, where do I finally wind up on that? I mean, I seem to want to retreat to my book. I say, we have no foundation, no floor, no ceiling. Either we retreat into a Bloomian Platonism, that's Alan Bloom, the University of Chicago scholar who wrote the book, The Closing of the American Mind, who said that we have to retreat to the truths of the past. It's a very Straussian position. Leo Strauss, who's a philosopher, who said these are fictions. Believe in God, believe in the Bible, believe in the Constitution, but they're useful for the unwashed masses. So I, as an intellectual, don't believe in them, but we have to preach them to organize society. So either if we have no foundation, no floor, no ceiling, either we retreat into a Bloomian Platonism, which is intellectually naive and dead, or we give a Herzogian shrug, that's Werner Herzog, and say stories are all we have and may the best story win, which is more or less a get out of jail free card for Trump, Putin, Surkov, Bannon, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, Xi, or Ben Modi. I think that's my rather despairing position, either that we retreat into a naive and conservative Bloomian Platonism, believing in these gods that no longer exist, which takes us back to the death of God, or we struggle with the idea of may the best story win. And I was talking to my friend Scott Kent Jones, with whom I did this mini book, which Doug also published. A Christian existentialist and a psychoanalytic atheist walk into a Trump rally. And Scott said, you know, Scott's the Christian existentialist. And he said, you know, I'm pretty sympathetic to may the best story win. And I guess I am too, which is very despairing. You know, Elizabeth Warren was on MSNBC talking about tax policy. And I just burst out in laughter because partly she's preaching to the choir on MSNBC, but also, you know, her very high-pitched voice, her earnest, sober manner, her pointing out, quote, tiny flaws in Trump's policy vis-a-vis tariffs. Like, it's not getting the job done. It's like she's trying to get an A in her class at Harvard. Trump is trying, it's why I do like that piece I did with that Sean Gorman guy about WWE. Trump understands how profoundly people vote out of enjoyment, out of our carnivalesque nature. And then I have a psychoanalytic reading, as you know, that he's incredibly wounded and he hands off the woundedness to the audience, which he transforms into transcendence. Like, you know, sort of like, fuck you all, here I am at McDonald's.
I stumped a fucking psychiatrist once. I said to the guy, because I was fucking gambling all the time, shit, right? I had a gambling addiction. I'm over it now, but shit. But he said, the psychiatrist, he said, you're using gambling, you're fixating on gambling in order to escape your real thoughts, you know? Mm-hmm. And I said to him, isn't that why you do everything in life? And literally, I stumped him.
He had no answer.
He was like, ah.
In Hegel's philosophy of right, the great philosopher wrote, as the thought of the world, philosophy appears only in the period after actuality has been achieved and has completed its formative process. The lesson of the concept, which necessarily is also taught by history, is that only in the ripeness of actuality does the ideal appear over against the real, and that only then does this ideal comprehend this same real world in its substance and build it up for itself into the configuration of an intellectual realm. When philosophy paints its gray in gray, then a configuration of life has grown old and cannot be rejuvenated by this gray in gray, but only understood. The owl of Minerva takes flight only as the dusk begins to fall. Another way of putting this, lifted from a Joni Mitchell song from 1970, is this: don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? We should remind ourselves that postmodernism arrived first and foremost through architecture, and that its arrival marked a recognition of defeat. According to the now late Marxist critic Frederick Jameson, the 1972 manifesto Learning from Las Vegas, written by Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, and Stephen Isanor, embraced space-age or Googie architecture, donut shops that were shaped like actual donuts, motels that were designed to complement the neon signs that announced their presence to the potential guests zooming by in Cadillacs and station wagons, coffee shops that looked like rockets, precisely because the ambitions of modernity had been abandoned. These buildings and the celebration of such buildings were messengers, and the news they brought had to be heeded. As Jameson put it, they inaugurated a whole new type of society, most famously baptized Post-Industrial Society by Daniel Bell, but also designated Consumer Society, Media Society, Information Society, Electronic Society, or High-Tech, and the like. The theorists of Googie or the postmodern had, according to Jameson, an obvious ideological mission of demonstrating, to their own relief, that the new social formation in question no longer obeys the laws of classical capitalism, namely the primacy of industrial production and the omnipresence of class struggle. I would suggest that when we ask ourselves how we got here, when we ask how it could be that the President of the United States has been and will likely be a tacky con man who used to sell steaks through the Sharper Image catalog, we should consider how the postmodern move was always, from the beginning, conservative. We should recognize that the insistence that we understand society as operating through consumerism and spectacle, rather than through class struggle and politics, as true as that assessment may have been for a while, always had an ideological purpose. This claim always appeared to be either an indictment or an edict, when in fact it was both. Donald Trump's arrival and continuation mark both the failure of Googie and post-industrial society and announce that this way of life has reached its zenith. Trump is here to tell us that politics is so dead that he represents its rebirth. Trump is telling us that class struggle is so dated, so long discarded, that Hulk Hogan and Tulsi Gabbard are now icons representing a working class revival. What is clear is that the era wherein society could transform Las Vegas into a think tank, into a mechanism of technocratic control, the aim of using the desires emerging from the masses to direct them, through nudges and subliminal messages, through psychosexual adverts and pop-up ads, towards complacency and ignorance, has ended. The owl of Minerva has taken flight. When Douglas Haskell, an architect and writer, first encountered Googie, a coffee shop in Los Angeles, he found it to be horrible but emblematic. He wrote, "It seems to symbolize life today, skyward aspiration blocked by Schwab's pharmacy." This is the ultimate meaning of Donald Trump. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.